When it's time to get popping off, that's when we don't get cops involved. Empty the clip to top it off. Go to the court, say drop it off. All lives matter, not at all. Pay vacations, knock us off. Shit ain't even subliminal. Call your kind of name, ain't a criminal. Why we afraid?
No More Sleep Game Script is all about helping you with your week-to-week fantasy football lineup. At No More Sleep, we give you data and information so that you can make informed decisions. Rather than tell you who to draft or what players to sit and start, the best approach is for you to make objective moves. You don't know what your lineup is going to look like. You're not sure what's going to happen. Look at Andrew Luck retiring all of a sudden, right? You don't want to rely on just people. You need to pay attention to the game script. Today's video is going to be focused on week 1 matchup between the Falcons and the Vikings. Now, given the fact that they did not play last year, there's no data that we'll give you from that perspective. When you look at 2017, there were way too many changes for us to rely on that. So what we'll do is look at strengths and weaknesses based on how each team finished last year in stats. We'll focus on the Falcons side of the ball first. Now, let's talk about the strengths at the Falcons. Now, one of the perceived strengths is that they have a good upside when it comes to running the ball. Obviously, Devonta Freeman was not healthy last year. Ito Smith wasn't necessarily reliable either. However, given the fact that they have a great offensive line and they even improved it that much more, and Devonta Freeman seemed to be, healthy so far, there are some other things that will give you some upside related to that backfield. The first is that last year, Falcons ranked number 12 in rushing average. So their rushing average, they had, one of the highest rushing averages across the NFL. There's some caveats to that. One of the reasons why they had one of the biggest rushing averages is because they had the least amount of attempts. So they were pretty much dead last in rushing attempts. Only 2 teams were worse in rushing attempts per game. So you're not going to get a lot of opportunity. If you have a running back on the Falcons team, don't expect to see a lot of attempts. What you want to look at is the next thing related to that rushing backfield. That's a highlight, and that's big run plays. So the Falcons were ranked top 3 in big run plays. So plays of 20 plus or 40 plus yards, they were ranked top 3, which means, again, that offensive line has proven to be reliable when it comes to that. So if you have a running back, you don't want to rely on attempts. You need a running back who is good with breakaway run rate, or if they are great at 20 plus, 40 plus run plays. You can determine that by looking at their rushing average. Lastly, another highlight for the Falcons is they were ranked number 2 in forced fumbles. So that's great. That means that the offense get more opportunities. And obviously from a receiving perspective and passing perspective, we know the Falcons can make a lot of yards and receiving yards. Now, the problem with that is that the majority of that goes to 2 players, Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley. So Calvin Ridley pretty much ate up all the receiving touchdowns. Julio Jones ate up most of the receiving yards. There are other guys there, obviously Mohamed Sanu and there's some others. But the main thing to understand is that they are playing against the Vikings. So the amount of production level that you can anticipate on average is probably going to come down a notch, and we'll talk about why, against the Vikings. So therefore, our number 1 highlight that we want to say is not the receivers on the Falcons, but pay attention to big play running backs if they are available on your team. If they are not, then the next thing you might want to look at is a receiver who has sure hands. So 80% catch rate or higher, at least 80% snap share, and anything less than 10% drop rate. And the reason for that is because the Falcons rank number 3 in receptions, which is great. However, we'll talk about the Vikings in a second. The Vikings is pretty good against receiving receptions. So you want to be careful about where those receptions come from. Again, if the running back can also catch, right? If the running back has the breakaway run rate, they could, get the big plays, and they are able to catch. That might be a better option than going with a Falcons wide receiver. But if you need to start a wide receiver on the Falcons, then you want to get someone who has receptions. The second thing is you're going to have to get a receiver with a receiving average of more than 10 yards per reception. We'll talk about the reasons why behind that. And then lastly, obviously the Falcons was ranked top, 5% in receiving touchdowns. So that's great. Now let's go over to some of the weaknesses on the Falcons. And I can tell you there's one word: defense. Falcons just don't have a good defense. And I know they're trying to work on it. They've made some moves during the offseason. The problem with the Falcons is that they tend to run a defense that is specifically based around. So Mike Smith like to, basically give everything up front and then just, try to protect the big plays. But here's the problem. Last year, they were ranked pretty much dead last in everything. They were bottom 10% in defense against rushing average. So they allowed the highest rushing average. That's why on a Vikings side, if you have a running back that has good rushing average, then you want to start them. I'm jumping ahead. I'll get to the Vikings in a second. But Falcons ranked bottom 10% in rushing average. They ranked bottom 30% in rushing TDs. So that means they were ninth. They allowed the ninth highest amount of rushing TDs. They were ranked bottom 15% in first down efficiency, which means that, they couldn't get off the field. They just kept giving up first downs. They ranked bottom 10% against reception. So they allowed the third highest amount of receptions. And then they were ranked bottom 12% for receiving touchdowns. So they allowed the fourth highest amount of receiving touchdowns. And it doesn't stop there. Even total rushing yards, they were bottom of the pack. So the Falcons is just not good on defense. So pretty much anyone on the Vikings, if you have them, you can start them against the Falcons. But let's talk more about the Falcons before we go to the conclusions. The Falcons, obviously, you would expect their defense to be the highlight, and they're absolutely the highlight right now. But some other strengths that they have was that they were number 4 in reception. So between Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen, these guys basically didn't drop the ball. So that's great against the Falcons, who allowed, again, was bottom 10% in receptions. Okay, so they allowed the third highest amount. So you can expect Stephon Diggs, Adam Thielen, or whoever else to have a good amount of receptions. So if you have a receiver who has sure hands, on the Vikings, you might want to think about starting them. Secondly, the Vikings was strong in reception TDs. A lot of that came from Stephon Diggs, but they were top 10 in receiving TDs. And as we know, Falcons ranked bottom 10%, 12% in allowing reception TDs. So touchdowns are going to be, readily accessible for any Vikings receiver. So anyone who has good red zone percentage on the Vikings, you might want to get. And then their defense was top 10 in pretty much everything. So let me give you the rundown here. They were top 10 in rushing average, which means they allowed one of the lowest rushing averages. Okay. They were top 10 in big rush plays. They allowed the least amount of rushing that was 20 plus, 40 plus yards. They were number 1 in forced fumbles. They were top 10 in receptions. So they allowed the least amount of receptions, and they were number 1 in receiving touchdowns. They allowed the least amount of receiving touchdowns. Moral of the story, when it comes to the Vikings defense, is basically you might not want to start anyone against them. There's very few weaknesses in that defense. There are a few in there. For example, they rely heavily on their middle linebackers. And as you know, they've been, necessarily not reliable there with the middle linebacker piece. Over the offseason, they were trying to figure it out as well. But they rely quite a lot on the middle linebackers, which can be a problem. And then secondly, their offense tend to have high time of possession. So that defense is typically trying to, from a game script perspective, when they're behind, obviously they're trying to get the ball back. But when they're ahead, the Vikings not being great in running, that was one of their weaknesses. I'll talk about that in a second. The time of possession was never really on the Vikings side. So regardless of what was happening with game script, the defense was pretty much exhausted. They were out there the entire time. And even when the Vikings offense was clicking, it was big plays. So it wasn't like they were eating up clock. So, and if they weren't eating up clock, it was, Kirk Cousins getting sacked. They improved the offensive line. We do expect it to be better. Time of possession will be better, and there will be more opportunities for the running backs. But one of the weaknesses is the running. Okay, so they were bottom 10% in rushing attempts per game. They were also bottom 10% in total rushing yards, and they were dead last in rushing average. Despite all the talent in that backfield and all the upside, unless this offensive line has completely made a 180 makeover, you can expect to see the same thing. Low rushing average, low rushing attempts per game, and low total rushing yards. I know the offensive coordinator is going to be focused on improving that rushing stat. However, you got to think about they're playing against a Falcons defense who isn't good, but one of the areas that the Falcons defense is good in is tackling, and they're pretty good at forcing fumbles. So if you have a running back who is not good at evading tackles, or on the Vikings team, or Vikings running back who seems to drop the ball or fumble the ball, you can guarantee game script wise it's not going to bode well for that individual. So what's the moral of the story for all of this? 4 main things. Number 1, expect receivers to be the focal point in this game. So you want to aim for any player that has a high red zone share on any of those teams. Second, look for big play running backs, because these running backs on both teams are not going to be getting those small plays. The Vikings, because of ability or lack thereof from a offensive line perspective, and the Falcons because of the way that they run, right? They just have big run plays in their line. They don't really look for small yards. So when they are successful, it's typically big plays. So on both sides of the balls, look for someone that has a good run rate, breakaway run rate, and is good at evading tackles. If you have that, then that's a good thing. The third conclusion here is expect many tackles and expect many fumbles. Maybe 3 to 4 fumbles in this game, and probably the highest amount of total tackles between both teams in week 1. So you want to avoid any offensive players that have butterfingers, period. If they have a high drop rate, if they are known for fumbling the ball, if they have a high fumbling percentage, stay away from them in this game, because these two teams are top of their game when it comes to forced fumbling. And then lastly, the last conclusion is expect many short pass attempts. Okay, I know the Vikings has this reputation for being a powerhouse, at receiving, right? And I talked about them having those strengths. They were number 4 in receptions, number 10 in receiving touchdowns. However, they had one of the lowest receiving averages. Their receiving average, I think, is 10.1. That's extremely low for the Vikings. All right, that doesn't make any sense. So that basically means that the majority of these receptions that they're getting are happening, within 10 or less yards. Okay, so that's not great because the Falcons' weakness is big plays. You might want to, exploit that, but I'm not sure that they will, given the fact that Kirk Cousins is running for his life most of the time. So that means the last conclusion is expect many short pass attempts on both sides of the ball. We explained already why the Falcons, you can expect, short pass attempts. Vikings is very good against receptions and very good against the big plays. So you can expect the Falcons to dump that ball earlier. And then I already gave you the reasons why the Vikings have short run play, have the shortest receiving average. So there's going to be a battle. If you're looking at defense, it's the battle of the linebackers, not defensive backs. Don't expect defensive backs to get too much recognition in this game. It will be the linebackers. It will be a lot of tackling. There will be some forced fumbles. And if there's any interceptions, it's probably going to come from the linebackers, not the DBs. So there you have it. I gave you a ton of information. That's the no more sleep way. Use that information to make an informed decision about who you play in week 1, the matchup between the Falcons versus the Vikings. No more sleep.
Get it, go get it, I got it. Get it, go get it, I got it. Get it, go get it, I got it. Get it, go.